Hello again, and welcome to another video in the Intro to Laserworks video series from Makerspace New Zealand. In this video we're going to be talking about advanced etching. So we're going to talk about the options that we didn't get to when we were talking about vector etching in the overview video, and we're also going to be talking about raster etching. And between the two of these you can really get a lot out of your laser cutter, but it is important to know when you might want to use one over the other and what the differences are. So to start with, we're going to be talking about vector etching, and this is pretty much what we talked about before. So I've got a vector shape here. If I turn off the etch preview, you can see that this is a series of vector outlines. Now if we look in the options here, this is all very much what we went over before. Now what we didn't talk about was a few things. This advanced menu here. Now, despite the fact that this advanced menu is to the right of processing mode, it's important to note that this is the same regardless of what this setting is. It doesn't change. If we click on the advanced menu, these are really advanced settings, and some of them are pretty specific to certain wiring setups and plugins. Generally, you would be best served to ignore this menu entirely. Occasionally, changing the laser frequency can have effects on etching, and you'll find forum posts which recommend that you do this. However, it is important to note that if you do start messing around with the frequency of your laser tube, you may end up damaging or even destroying it entirely. So be very, very, very careful if you do decide to use this, and my personal recommendation would be don't open this options menu at all. Really don't want to mess with it unless you know what you're doing. Alright, so the other advanced options menu down here is much less scary than the one up there. So this one is only available if you're in scan mode. It does change. And this one basically just opens up one more option for you if you're etching. So if we look at a preview window of a regular etch, let me just zoom in on the edge here, you can see that it's created by building it up out of lines, same as every other etch we've looked at before. It's a bunch of lines that creates the shape bit by bit. But if you look really closely at this edges here, you can see that you could, if these lines were far enough apart, you could get kind of a stair-step pattern on the edge here, or if there's a little bit of play in your belts, you know, this may be a bit less sharp, or if you're running too fast, this could be a bit blurry. So what happens if you want a really, really sharp, clean edge on your etch? Well, one of the ways to get that is after you've done the main etching to get the shape down, you could then run the laser around the outlines of the shapes that you've etched. And so you'll end up with a very smooth, very clean outline, and it's a definite visual style. Some people like it, some people don't. It really depends on what you're trying to do with your laser, but it is an option. And what this advanced menu does is provides you with a little bit of help for doing that. So if we click Mark outlines after etching, let's just leave the default settings. That's a bit fast, but we don't care. And we look at the preview window again. You can see that now we have a line here around the outlines of the shapes. So what the laser is going to do is it's going to etch this shape first, and then it's going to cut these outlines. Now, in theory, you could also use this for cutting these shapes out entirely. However, note that since it will be running the laser around the outlines of every single shape, generally this won't result in a usable item. You'll just have a pile of etched things in the bottom of the laser bed. So generally don't want to turn the power up so much it's going to cut through, but it's very good for just adding a little bit of definition to your etches. Now, two other options in here is independent output and ramp effect. So I'm just going to show off ramp effect first. Now this one's a bit of a situational one, and it's very difficult to see without the right settings, so I'm just going to turn that speed up so that we can see it nice and fast. And now ramp effect does use minimum and maximum power, so you do want these numbers to be a bit different. I've set it to very much the extremes. Most lasers won't go down this low, and even if they did, they definitely wouldn't fire at this percent power, so don't do this under normal circumstances. I'm just trying to demonstrate. If we go into the preview here and run the simulation, you can start to see kind of a pattern here. So around the edges, it's trying to basically ramp the power in. So it turns the power down at the edges and ramps it up to full towards the middle here. It tries to give it kind of a beveled effect. this can situationally be good, but generally because varying power doesn't have the kind of effects that you might expect from a laser, this doesn't give the best results. So I personally stay away from this option, but feel free to experiment and you may find some really cool uses for it. Please note also that when you enable ramp effect, ramp length is enabled. If you leave it at 0, then as you saw in the preview, it just tries to kind of estimate what you might want. But you can set specific ramp lengths. I'm just going to turn that off for now, and actually also turn off mark outlines after etching. Okay. And that's actually a note. It can be difficult to figure out if you've got this on or off, which is why checking the preview window before running a job is often a good idea. Because you can only see if this is enabled or not if you actually click on the advanced menu. There's no indicator either here or in this layer window whether you're going to draw the outlines afterwards. So maybe occasionally check this if you use it. You don't want to accidentally leave this on. All right, the last option, I've got to change the setup a little bit here. Let me just actually turn this back to default settings here. All right, so if we just run this as is with independent output on, you can see that this actually is going to look exactly the same. This is going to look like a regular etch. And the reason is because independent output has one very specific use. If you are, just zoom out here, if you are setting up a large array of objects, you're doing a production run of something similar, then let's just put this here and then make another one over here on the opposite side. Let me just turn independent output back off. If you're doing a full production run with 2 objects at either end of the bed like this, and we just run the preview, you might notice it's taking a while for the preview window to come up. And now that it has, the total time on this is going to be 2 hours and 42 minutes. That seems excessive for just these 2 shapes. And the reason for that is that it's going to go from one to the other. It's evaluating the entire artboard as one shape. So the laser's spending all this time moving from one shape to the other when it's not firing. So laser time is 17.5 minutes. But total time is close to 3 hours. This is extremely inefficient. You really don't want it to be doing this. And the way we fix that is by enabling independent output. This will try to sort of view each one of these blocks as an independent shape. And so now if we run a preview, it comes up a lot faster, and the total time now is only 32 minutes. Well, 33 really. And now what it's going to do is it's going to etch this entire shape, then it's going to go over and etch this entire shape. It's going to save a lot of time. And the reason why you might not want to use independent output is that while the software does its best to try and group objects together, and you might notice on this shape it's figured it out quite nicely because of how close together these are, it's not always perfect. So if the shape had things that were spaced out a little bit more, it might end up doing, let's say, each one of these sunburst legs independently. And you'd waste a lot of time slowing down and speeding up again on the reversal that it really didn't have to. So it would just take a little longer in the situation that we weren't doing a production run. That said, it certainly wouldn't be wrong to simply always leave it on. It would mean that you never ended up in a situation where you accidentally had another shape out here and it ended up taking forever. So it's really hard to interrupt and resume an etch partway through on the laser. Once an etch is going, you don't want to stop it. So you could just always leave it on, but generally it's a little bit faster and more reliable if you leave it off. You'll always end up with the same etch eventually. It's just with independent output on, sometimes it could be a bit faster if you're doing production runs. With it off, it could be a bit faster if you're just doing single shapes like this one. All right, that's everything in the vector window that might be of use. Let me just return it to its default state. And check, turn that off. Yes, okay. So that is vectors. And the next thing we're going to talk about is raster images. So I have a raster image here set up, and it's the same as the vector shape. So if I import this, this looks very, very, very similar to the vector shape that we brought in before. And in fact, I'll just re-import the vector shape. Let me move it to the right here using nudge. and assign it to the blue layer. The first thing you'll notice is that we now have two blue layers. One of them has bitmap etched over the top of the color, and the other one does not. So obviously this one here is the bitmap image, and this one here is the vector image. And if we look closely at each one of them, you can really start to see the difference. So this one, when we pick a random edge and we zoom in on it, you might notice that it retains its level of detail regardless of how closely we zoom in. Vector is a mathematical representation. There's no point at which this stops being a line. Whereas here, we have a collection of pixels. So if we zoom in on that same place, you can see that it starts getting very, very, very pixelated along here. And you can see that in the preview window. So in the preview, if we zoom in on the vector one, you can see a pretty clean, clear line here. We go over to the raster one, much, much, much less so. You can really see the individual pixels where they are in the preview. And that's not to say that you'll be able to see them after you etch it. And in fact, on a shape this size, you really wouldn't be able to see it. But it is a little bit less detail, and if your image was lower resolution than this one, you actually really would start to see it. And with raster images, you have the ability for them to be blurry or for them to have gray in there. So if you're doing clean, clear outlines, you really want to go with vector shapes. And also, please note that if I go into the settings for this bitmap layer, and on this one, if I go back and say mark outlines after etching, now on the vector one, as you'll recall, that was sharpening up each individual etch. But if we enable that on the raster one, it's instead going to draw an outline around the bitmap itself. And that's situationally useful, but very, 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 very different. We're not going to get that same level of clarity on the edges of the shapes. In fact, we've still got that stair step, and we don't have a line there. So generally, if you're doing these black and white high contrast image etches, you really want to stick with vectors if you can. Now there is a way to convert this to vectors in the Laserworks software. So when you have an image in the scene, you can select it and you can go to an option, it's called the bitmap handle. There's a button right here to get into it, or you can go to handle, bitmap handle. And we're going to talk about these settings up here in a little bit, but for the moment, the only thing that's important to this image is get outline. So if we click that, you can see that it's decided, okay, that's where all the vector lines go. We can click OK. Now it's kept our bitmap image here, but we can delete that. And now we have our outline. So you can see here it hasn't quite finished the shape. And you can still see the pixels here. They're a little bit better. They're not quite as blocky, but it's still quite rough. So I would recommend that if you want to do something like this, generally you'll want to either work with a higher resolution image, or you're going to work with something like Adobe Illustrator or Inkscape, or something that will allow you to trace this with a little bit more control. Those programs would give much better results. But it's an option if you do want to use it. There's nothing stopping you from starting out with this and then going in there and cleaning up these shapes and deleting the excess points, etc. All right, let's clear that out. Now another thing you can do with raster images is you can etch a little more complicated subject matter. So now if we go to import and we bring in this cat. Now obviously this is going to be a lot trickier to etch. We don't have that clear distinction between black and white. This isn't clear shapes, and so the computer's going to struggle a little bit trying to figure out what to do with this. In this case, if we just etch this without any other options, what it's going to do is anything that it figures is close enough to white, it's going to assign to white, so like this area here, so it's not going to etch this. And anything that's dark enough, it's going to say, okay, that's black. And so it will etch these markings around the eye, the forehead here, probably this roof. Let's take a look. Okay, yeah, that's about what I expected to see. So it still kind of looks like a cat, but we've lost a lot of the detail. We've lost a lot of what made this image interesting. And that's not to say that this is necessarily bad, and in some cases it may be good enough. But it's not really what I had in mind. So let's look at how to improve this. The first thing we should do is go through some options that we have for raster images that we didn't for vectors. So if we see here, we've got 3 additional tick boxes. These are grayed out on the vector editing. So negative engrave, very straightforward. All it does is swap black and white. So if we look at the image again, it's the inverse. And in this case, this looks a little bit better because we've got the eyes here. And I'm not sure how this would look actually etched, but it's at least slightly better in my opinion. The next one is optimize scan. This one, you won't really see the difference in the preview window. What it basically does is tries to have the software be a little bit smarter about when it figures light and dark are. It'll throw out little tiny specks and stuff and just try to clean up the edges a little bit. It's often a good idea to have this on, but not always. If you're not sure whether to turn this on or not, try etching one of each and see which one turns out better, but usually you can leave this on. Now, Output Direct is kind of another kettle of fish entirely. This will change the entire way that the laser etches raster images. So rather than simply trying to figure out white and black, what it'll instead do is take the image and assign each pixel a power setting based on our min and max power. Now, under normal circumstances, you never take min power down to 1%, but I'm going to do it just for demonstration purposes here. So now if we bring up the preview window again, it's going to take a lot longer to load. But when it loads, you can see here that we have pretty much the original image. And so what it's done is it's assigned a one-to-one mapping of brightness to the amount of laser power. So anywhere that's white is very low power, anywhere that's black is very high power. And this looks great in the preview window, but unfortunately it's not going to look as great if you actually try to etch this onto some material. In theory, you would think lower power might mean a lighter etch, higher power is a darker etch, so you can have this. But in reality, well, the mapping between power and darkness is definitely not linear and often isn't even in the same direction. Higher power sometimes can be lighter. But also when you start getting down to the low power levels, the difference between not etched at all and etched a little bit can actually be quite huge. So I generally stay away from this option. I find it more trouble than it's worth. But depending on the material, this could actually give quite a good result. And often people ask how to do this, so that's how. Okay, so let's turn Output Direct back off. And also turn off Mark Outlines after etching. And put this back to 30. Now, Output Direct is one way to use the grayscale of the image to adjust what the laser does, but it's not the only way. If we go back to the bitmap handle, now we can start using these settings up here. And what these allow us to do is kind of get to more interesting algorithms to convert the grayscale to black and white. So rather than simply saying, okay, this is, anything be above a certain level of gray, let's just treat that as white. Anything below a certain level of gray, treat it as black. It'll allow us to do more clever things with it. So if you've ever seen close-up pictures of newsprint, for example, how it's lots of little dots which kind of come together to make the images when you look at them from further out, dithering is much the same thing. So if we turn on dithering, let's say a net graphic around 10 lines an inch frequency, you can see that that's very much the same effect. We can still see the detail here. You can still see this fur coloration up here on the forehead that makes the kind of characteristic M. But what this is actually made of is nothing but black and white. You zoom in, we've got just black and white, no gray in here whatsoever. And the laser is very, very responsive, so it will be able to hit all of these little tiny detail marks without having to worry about mid-level darkness. So you don't have to worry about gray, it's just etch or don't etch. And this will give probably the best result of grayscale etching that you can, is this kind of effect. Now, as you may notice here, it's difficult to kind of figure out what it's going to look like because the preview window is not great. It's not doing any anti-aliasing itself, which if you don't know what that is, don't worry about it. Just note that the preview window does not show the final object. You kind of have to zoom in to a certain point and start seeing the pixels before you get a decent idea of what it's going to look like. And there are other options in here. Instead of net graphic, you could use dot graphic instead. You can see uses much finer dots. The laser can sometimes have trouble with dots this small, but if the laser can handle it, this will definitely give the best result because of how fine this is. Now, if the dots are too small, you can use set output resolution. So if we set this to, let's try 72. Okay, that didn't have much effect. Let's try 40. There. Now you can see that with dot graphic, using the output resolution to change this can have some good effects because it changes the size of the dots. In fact, we can even go down to 30. That gives a pretty decent effect. Maybe 40 was better. You really want it small enough so you get good detail without being so small that the laser can't handle the dots. You really want these to kind of line up with the etch lines so that it can figure this out nicely. And net graphic is good with a decent frequency. Lower is better because if we turn the frequency down here, you can see that this is going to be a lot easier for the laser to handle. But there's always going to be some trial and error. Just sort of see what works on your material. Now to actually apply this to the view, you might notice here that this hasn't updated. We can either apply to view to apply to the preview what we want and then click OK, which will apply this to the base material. Or we can click Apply to Source. Now it's important to note that there is a cancel button here, but once we've applied to source, cancel will not revert further. So if we click Apply to Source now, and now we click Invert Color and say Apply to View, if we click Cancel, let's zoom out so it updates, it hasn't applied the inverse, but it has applied the dot graphic. So maybe spend a little bit of time with the bitmap handle figuring out the difference between apply to view and apply to source and when you can say OK and cancel safely, because it's not a fun thing to get wrong. Brightness and contrast can be quite useful too, depending on your image, but in this case, we want all the fine detail, so no reason to mess with that. Before we stop talking about this, one last quick comment. You don't have to use Laserworks to make these dot graphic and net graphics. You can actually make these in your image editing program of choice. And I'm actually going to show you real quick how to do this in Adobe Photoshop version 2 real quick, which is quite an old version, but the process is still similar. So if I bring up Photoshop and we've got that same image, if we go into Filter and say Pixelate Color Halftone, ideally I'd prefer a black and white halftone, but that's not an option. You just have to use the color halftone and fudge it. And max radius of 8 pixels is fine. Let's make all of these numbers 45. Every single one. I say OK. And now we've got pretty much the same effect as that net graphic. Only in this case it's a halftone pattern. So it's a bunch of dots. Now this actually is how newsprint works. So this is the exact effect. And we've got these black dots of varying sizes which make up our grayscale. And we can adjust the size of these dots. I've just Control-Z to undo. And let's do a color halftone again, but this time with a radius of 4. And you can see that this is a lot smaller. The dots are still there, but they're just much smaller. And so in this way, you can set things up outside of Laserworks and get them exactly like you want them before you even import them, and then the laser can process this. Because it's still black and white. We don't have much in the way of gray here, but we have actually made it into a pretty good grayscale image just using the black and white. Again, trial and error will show you which has the best outcome, but these are several tools in your toolbox to get the most out of etching. That's it for this video. Thank you for watching, and I will see you again.